So we've come to our final week looking at discipleship and the challenges of Jesus. And this week we are looking at suffering. Now each week we looked at some of the challenging words of Jesus. We looked at the cost of following Jesus, the call to obedience and devotion. And each of these, of course, kind of link into one another, that if we really want to be obedient, we're called to be obedient, and we want to be obedient, we know that that will ultimately lead to devotion and all-out commitment to Jesus. And that this commitment and all-out kind of devotion to him will need to be weighed up, that ultimately it will cost us. Because to be devoted means to give our resources, our time, our energy, our heart, our affections towards Jesus. And this might mean considering how we spend our time, our money, what relationships we're in, weighing these things up. And of course, ultimately, that may lead to some form of suffering, some form of hardship. Now, this week we're going to look at several passages of around suffering and this theme, especially the words of Jesus and what he said to his disciples about what it looks like to follow him. And we're going to start in John's Gospel. And in John's Gospel, in chapter 15, 16, Jesus says several challenging things about following him, and in particular about the potential suffering that we may experience as a result of following him. Now, this section of John is Jesus kind of preparing his disciples for his death, his resurrection, but in particular for their life after those events, including the coming of the Holy Spirit, but also what it will look like to be disciples, that they will experience hardships and potential suffering along the way. So let's read some of the passages. Firstly, in John 15, verse 18 to 21, it says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. This is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me." Then in chapter 16, verse 22, it says, "So with you, now is your time of grief. But will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." Then in verse 33 of chapter 16, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Now there's some encouragements in this passage as well. There's this promise of this future joy and rejoicing that will take place when we see Jesus again. There's this encouragement to take heart because Jesus has overcome the world. But there is also this challenge in this passage that in particular, some of the suffering that we may experience as Christians will be as a result of our relationship with Jesus. That because of our connection with him, that we may suffer. Now, looking at the life of Jesus, I guess there's lots that we could say about suffering, and there's lots of different types of suffering and lots of different explanations we give for reasons for suffering and lots of theology in around that. But I want us to focus in this evening, or whenever you're studying these questions today, on this idea of two types of suffering. Firstly, in the life of Jesus that we see is the type of suffering experienced because he was a human. And secondly, the type of suffering that he experienced because he was an obedient son to God. Now, hopefully you recognize that both of those can be true of us as well, that we suffer in these ways because we are human, and that we are called to be obedient children as well. And as a result of that obedience and that relationship to God, we may suffer. So firstly, looking at the human suffering side to Jesus, we don't read lots of kind of practical elements about Jesus' life, about his day-to-day living, but we get glimpses of what his life looked like throughout the Gospels. We're told that he had no place to lay his head. So there's an extent to which Jesus experienced poverty. He clearly was on the run when he was a child, when he was a baby with his parents. And again, you could look at that and say, okay, he's experienced poverty and hardship. And some look at that and say he was a type of refugee experiencing human suffering. We read of passages where he was hungry and tired, where he was thirsty. And we also know that he experienced grief with the death of his cousin John the Baptist and his close friend Lazarus. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 15-16 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. We have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin." Now, the interesting thing about Jesus is that he doesn't allow this human suffering to take him away from his obedience and devotion. It's not because he's emotionless, not because he's detached from what's happening on a human level, because he was fully man. But because ultimately he knows that his kingdom is not of this world, the words that he speaks in John's Gospel. So, for example, when he hears about Lazarus dying, he stays committed to what God has called him to do, and he doesn't travel for 2 days. And then there's this conversation he has with his disciples when he says, okay, now we're going to travel back. And they say, actually, Jesus, I don't think it's a good idea that we should go back, because last time we went there, you were nearly stoned. And so it's interesting looking at Jesus' response in this story, because there's this response in him that holds back from going towards this hard situation of his friend dying when he knows that he could help. You know, our response in that situation would be to run towards them, and yet Jesus holds back. And then when the disciples actually have a bit of time to think about it and perhaps get past that natural response, they say, actually, it's probably best if we don't go, because last time he was very nearly stoned because of your mission, because of who you are. And yet Jesus says, no, we're going to go. See, he clearly feels this human suffering, the grief of losing his friend. And we see that when he weeps. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. But Jesus clearly doesn't let this human suffering, this struggle that he's going through, to define who he is or to define his mission. So he experiences human suffering, but he doesn't allow it to define what he's going to do or who he is. This is what we are called to do too when we follow Jesus, to take God's lead on what we should do, to be obedient, to ask him how we should respond to what happens around us. You know, in the Gospels, Jesus says that there will be wars and rumors of wars. There will be famines and earthquakes. Jesus is in effect saying that, hey, while the earth and humanity is in this fallen state, there will be human suffering. It's a matter of fact, and it will be a factor in your lives as disciples. However, if we follow the way of Jesus with Jesus, we will have the Comforter, the Holy Spirit with us. And we will also have a different way to live, a different way to navigate these difficult seasons in our lives, a way of devotion and obedience. But ironically, this way of devotion and obedience may also lead to more suffering. And Jesus approaches this head on in the gospel. We see that in the story of Lazarus, that even though he might get stoned, he decides, no, I'm going to go back to Judea because I know that's where I'm called to go. That's what my mission is. The ultimate example of Jesus on the cross. Jesus does not shy away from this part of his calling. He doesn't shy away from this mission that he came to serve and to save the lost. He suffers on the cross, the most horrendous, awful of deaths. But he's willing to do it to be obedient and to show his devotion to his Father, but also his love for us. See, when Jesus calls us to follow his way, he demonstrates it. And we've looked at that a lot over the last few weeks. But we also see this type of suffering across the New Testament. We see it with Saul when he's persecuting the New Testament church. And we see that in the death of Stephen in the letter of Acts. And then we see it in the life of Paul, that he gets imprisoned and other apostles like John and Peter get arrested too. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 to 11, it says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." See, Jesus is saying that life following him can actually lead to ridicule. And in its most extreme, it could lead to persecution and even death. Now, we in the West have perhaps only experienced this in small portions, or perhaps you have experienced it on a larger scale. For many of us, it will be ridicule. But even if we experience ridicule, it can be really difficult to keep following the way of Jesus, especially if that ridicule comes from ones that we love, ones that we care about, ones that we value. But we, of course, have seen this persecution across the global church too. But as Christians, we are called to be set apart, to live differently. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, and it is this kingdom that we invited to be a part of, to become citizens of. This is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, and it will perhaps lead to suffering. And this kingdom includes the salvation that Jesus offers. It includes the comfort of the Holy Spirit, the living hope of our assured future in Jesus too. Yes, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. Jesus has overcome the world. What a promise we can take with us into our hardships and our suffering, that although things may be hard, Jesus is with us. And he has done all that is needed to guarantee us a joyous future in him. This is what it means to follow the way of Jesus with Jesus, whether we experience the suffering that comes as a result of simply being a human, or whether we experience suffering as a result of being a follower of Jesus. Our call is to be followers of Jesus, following the way of Jesus with Jesus, putting him first, offering him our obedience and our devotion, counting the cost, experience suffering if it's required, and giving our all to him, the one who gave us his all first. Have a great time discussing the questions. There's a little bit of time for you to pray for the persecuted church, and also just some questions about the whole series as a whole as you wrap up as a life group. Hope you have a great time discussing, and see you all soon.